Peace and blessings, family. This is your brother asarimhotep with the Madhu Mandela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. Today we have a very special and powerful guest, Dr. Andrew Jaggs, all the way from the UK, who is an Africologist and historian. And today we're going to talk about a myriad of things, including his recent work on the possible relationship between the Yoruba and the ancient Egyptian. We'll probably talk about research methods, oral tradition, and whatever comes to mind as the evening rolls. And so, with that said, more when we come back. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Thank you all for joining. Before you move on, please make sure that you smash the like so we can break the YouTube algorithms so more and more people can hear these powerful interviews that we're doing on this channel. Make sure that you share the program, once you have reviewed it. And if you are new to this channel, make sure that you hit the subscribe button so that every time I upload a video or we do a live, you will be the first person to know, and you can adjust your time, including your wedding, to view the live show or the video that we just uploaded. And so with that said, welcome to the Mbongi. And again, we have a very, very powerful guest with us, and he's joining us all the way from the UK. Before I bring my guest on, Dr. Andrew Jaggs, just want to remind the family that we do have a Patreon page, and you can help support this channel in the upcoming documentary film titled Chiena Into at patreon.com/asarimhotep, and find out all of the different gifts that you can get and the different levels of support that you can provide. Any amount helps, and your support is appreciated very, very, very greatly. And currently right now, the latest video that we have exclusive for our Patreon members is the interview with Dr. Zulumatabo Zulu. We interviewed him in South Africa. Well, I was here in the United States. He was in South Africa. And, we like to introduce the world to some of our top-notch scholars from around the world. So, we're going to continue that tradition today. And so if you are viewing this from Patreon and you have not seen this video, I would encourage you to look on the homepage and look for Dr. Zulumatabo Zulu's very powerful, interview. And so with that said, and that being the end of my announcements, I like to bring in to the stream Dr. Jaggs. How you doing, sir?
Greetings, blessings. I'm very well, thank you very much. And sending regards out to all the audience listening.
Oops, hold on. I appreciate it very greatly. And I know it is late there, so, I don't want to bring you into the wee hours of the morning. I know you have a busy day and a lot is going on over there in the UK. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you. I have been interacting with you off and on for a number of years, and all dealing with the African history. And at the time, you were working on your PhD, and you recently defended it. And so, before we get into your research, your current and ongoing research, can you tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of where you are from, and how did you get interested in African history? What led you on that path to the point where you decided, what, I'm going to pursue a PhD in this particular subject?
Okay, thank you for that question. Myself, I've always been close with the African culture and heritage. My mother, she coined a carnival mass band called Elemu. And within that, there's always been different themes, including ancient Egypt, what we obviously call Kemet. We also encounter a lot of the other themes relating to Adinkra symbols and stuff like that. But it was always on the periphery. The main influential factor for myself was my godmother, Reverend Patricia Stevens, who also coined a book dealing with the spiritual Baptist faith, explaining the different African retentions and the different practices. Now, how I ended up getting more into the academic side was that having worked at a school, I worked at a secondary school, namely with target children of African or Black heritage. And I also ended up getting involved in doing a particular role with empowerment at Recruitment Center. Now, the Recruitment Center was run by a man called Von Lee Joseph. He was very much deep into the African ancient history. So a lot of the signs, symbols, would be up and in and around. But I wasn't so deep at that time. If honest, I had a time where I was more into what would verge on conspiracy and a bit doom and gloom. I then got a lot more into the empowerment with the motivation and worldview stuff. Some of it more verging on what we would call, Anthony Robbins, Wayne Dyer, Deepak Chopra. So it wasn't so much based on the African ethics, although I'd always been very aware of the African ingenuity. Obviously, with the carnival, every year there's these amazing, beautiful costumes that are made, and most of the people are Black descent. So it's quite clear that that would always be in the background. However, the ancient history and the penny dropping of its significance hadn't really at all fostered. Now, while I'm working at the recruitment center, which was called PLG, Peace, and so within that, there was a chance to do the empowerment, but Volume Joseph, was always a bit more like, you know what, you should include a bit more of the African. And I was thinking he was thinking more just like a bit more proverbs, or perhaps even stereotypically in the back of my head, because I haven't been so reading the deep philosophy, such as Africa Carruthers talks about African deep thought and stuff like that. So those things hadn't settled in. So perhaps I wasn't aware of how deep it would go, and so I wasn't necessarily exposed to it. But he wrote a group of books for me to read, and some of those at the time where my mind was at, they seemed a bit heavy or a bit hard, even with destruction of Black civilization, African origin of civilization, like. And so it was upon watching really a Ashra Kwesi documentary talking about the African origin, I believe, of Christianity, that one really sort of fermented a different understanding of the ancient Nile and how relevant it is to Black people or people of African heritage. So from that, I ended up doing a lot more research, and typically most of it was online, and there was a sort of a few people who were selling DVDs, so a lot of documentaries and lectures that were, but it was a diverse range. And at the time, I wasn't necessarily aware on who was more grounded on the evidence or hadn't really found my own path, so to speak. But what ended up happening, there was an encounter with Sabo Amun Sakana, who happens to be a good friend at the time, hanging around a lot with my godmother, Reverend Pat Stevens. So there was three events, one of which was a Trinidad 50th Independence event. The other was a fundraiser for an island that had been hit by, I believe, a hurricane at the time. And the third event was at my godmother's house. Now, the first time I had really just got started feeling so amazed about the legacy of the Moors, namely from Van Sertima and a handful of other scholars which were talking about it. And so there's one man called the Investigator, and he kind of uh, raises ways in which it's so relevant to today and stuff. So that was really amazing me at the time. But when I was at this particular event for the 50th anniversary, I was there with Sabra Mutakana, who's the owner of Karnak House, and they published several books, one of which we'll probably raise later, which is Benga's book, which is the Ancient Egypt and Black Africa Student Handbook, and he's published many other books in between the decades. But he also published my godmother's book, but I wasn't aware of his, so to speak, knowledge of Black history and the alternative Black history, so to speak. And so when I leaned over to him and I said, "Oh, are you aware about the Moors and how they're Black?" Like, and he was like, "Yeah," like as if that's like common knowledge. But I was so buzzing on it at the time, so to speak, I wasn't sure if he really knew it. Then the second event, which I believe was about 2 weeks later, I'm not sure if it was Montserrat off the top of my head, but it was it had been ravaged. Several of the islands were ravaged by the hurricane, and so at this fundraiser, I sort of lean over to him and I'm like, you know about how like the ancient Egyptians, like they like can relate to like wider African culture or something like that. And he's
Mm-hmm.
like kind of like, oh yeah, a bit more tantalized, but it seemed a bit like common knowledge to him. I'm thinking, I don't know if he really knows this, because for me at the time, you know, when you're taking new information, it feels so empowering or enlightening, energizing. You feel everyone almost wants to know this or should know this. And then the third occasion, I'd actually been looking a lot more at certain cosmologies. I think it was Igbo and the early phase where it was kind of wet or very marshy, and sort of tying it into Nu and Anu, like, and several of the different cosmologies which spring out of such a cosmology. And so when I said that to him, and it seemed like I actually was more aware of what they call in the mainstream Hermeopolitan and the Heliopolitan, you know, those different cosmologies of and the Memphite, but tying it into the different groups, he seemed like really excited and overjoyed. And he goes, "Do you know what? I'm going to write down 4 books for you." And interestingly, the books that he wrote down, a couple of them he published, which includes Carruthers' Divine Speech, which investigates African deep thought, and then the other one was the Benga book I referenced earlier, Student's Handbook. And there also was a Sheikh Anta Diop, but he recommended either African origin or civilization or barbarism, but said they sort of prove both the same argument. Unfortunately, got both. So at the time, and there was also Genesis of the Pharaohs by Wilkinson. Now, at the time, it was exactly what I was sort of needing in my sort of search for whether it's truth, enlightenment, and online. You know, there's so many different paths, but it's not always rooted on what is it based on at times, or you're not always aware of it because clearly someone giving a lecture isn't always taking it back to the sources. So when I had that, I sort of like, you know, it's like a hungry monster, feed me kind of thing almost. And when I came back to him, pretty much hoping to get another batch of 4 recommendations, thinking that was delicious. He could have, because he has actually a large catalogue of different books he's published over time, and many of which I've actually subsequently got for the research. But he could have easily have just like given me a next 4 recommendations. But I think he could see my enthusiasm, or just recommend it in general, where they're doing at Birkbeck they were doing a Egyptology part-time course, and you could do like the 3 modules, and then that would enable you to get the certificate and of Egyptology, and then you'd be able to do the diploma. So fate and fortune had it where at the time I was thinking, but why would I want to go there? Like, because you know, through the African centered scene, and I should highlight that I've been very much just taking in what would be kind of key figures of the African centered or Afrocentric kind of a paradigm sort of thing. So it seemed nonsensical to go to a institute where we would see it as them just grossly distorting, misrepresenting, and not promoting what would be the vibe and essence of what makes a genuine African culture. Of course, that's what African centered scholars engage with. Now, he said, but if you go there, you'll get to hear the different arguments and certain sources and stuff, and kind of framed it to myself as though, you know, if there's 1,000 pieces that, you know, for the African centered argument, we kind of zoom into the elements which obviously allow us to go deeper or see that cultural connection with Africa, but kind of highlighted, you know, there's a lot to it, so to speak, and recommended it. So I thought, well, if he's read these different books which I found so good and he's recommending it, then I can obviously see that there's probably relevance and value in that. Although I was very skeptical in because typically, if you listen to some of the different talks or things, you'll just see it as, the last place you want to go if you want to learn African culture is to somewhere which is going to sort of just chop it up and misrepresent it. That's obviously with the mainstream. It's about trying to digest things in linear pockets, and there's a whole different uh, not just methodology but objective at times. But going back to the sequence of it, it was from when I ended up getting onto the Birkbeck. I did the certificate that was with Lorna Oates and Carol Andrews. Carol Andrews did one of the versions of it's called Book of the Dead, but obviously it was Peret and Haru, where she also did in that edition a lot of the images. So you had a lot of the scenes and vignettes, they call them, as part of it, which was useful in various ways. She also did an interesting book on the jewelry and amulets, which I found some of it for my research or the thesis, doctoral thesis that I just uh, passed on, that were obviously utilized in there. So after having done the certificate, and if I'm honest with you, and I should highlight this, is that there's different abstractions or different paradigms and worldviews. And when you look at things from different angles, you can obviously see very different things. So when I'm originally coming into it, anytime they're not mentioning various different big points which are key to, let's say, the Afrocentric paradigm, you would almost want to contest or be contesting kind of thing. So they didn't mention Tassetti, you'll be like really like vexed kind of thing. And you're like really, what's the word for it? It's going with a sort of paradigm of it's a battle, not necessarily trying to let me see you coax out what I can heed from, learn from, and potentially rebuttal where and where needed. So when I got into the diploma, I had a choice of which was at Birkbecker as well. They with they had it where you could choose archaeology or you could do the literature. Now it was with Joseph Clayton. Interestingly, that same Joseph Clayton, I believe he's completed his PhD. So doctor, he has done an important translation of one of the texts which we know from one of the Wadi texts, which gives us a whole different interpretation or potentially understanding of cross-regional trade into the what we know as the Libya or Libyan desert, so to speak. So that's something else to potentially touch upon later. But doing the literature was really good because, if honest with you, you can sometimes think or have a paradigm and a model which, when you're doing the literature and rethinking it, and certainly there are some texts like what's called the the shipwrecked sailor. We went over it several weeks, and interestingly, I was kind of like, why are we going over it again? Like, surely let's move on to the next story, though. But going over it several times, as he did, allowed me to sort of find various interesting things. Like, for example, certain scholars have actually pondered that there's various similarities to what are initiatory um, aspects, such as the idea of, you disappear and have a certain ordeal and then return anew, like a rebirth and stuff. And so there's various things that ended up also allowing me to really dissect some of the different texts, which subsequently for the thesis was very useful. I actually did try to get into SOAS, but it didn't go as smoothly as I intended. I'm not sure if it was, because I was kind of told as long as you pass your diploma and stuff, it's kind of cool runnings. But obviously, I stated my main objective is to look at the ancient Nile in relation to it is in its African context. So you never know, but it was really a blessing in disguise because I ended up going to the Institute of Archaeology, which is really like a belly of the beast, which is affiliated with UCL in London. And they're both really near each other to SOAS and UCL there within
And what's
proximity.
quick question? What's the university that you went to do the PhD?
Yeah, so the MA in Egyptian archaeology and the PhD were both performed at UCL Institute of Archaeology. So the
Okay.
Institute of Archaeology over the years has had a lot of the people who have been very influential on different tides of world history and like seminal in sort of disclosing the past by digging up based on what we can touch, hold, and measure. So that's what sort of makes archaeology a bit distinctive from, let's say, literature, where you can more explore and try and hypothesize more what they may have been thinking and trying to imply. Whereas with the archaeology, stereotypically, they're based on what can I touch, hold, measure, and it sort of confines lots of lines of arguments around that. But as I was saying, I with the MA, and tell me if the story ends up extending on too long for you and that. But simply, what was quite a blessing that while doing the diploma, I did the actual thesis for that on the ancient Egyptian worldview in relation to foreign lands and people. And I contacted Stephen Quirk during that period. Interestingly, he was one of the few scholars that I contacted, a handful of ones who I could see their emails for. He was one of the few people who responded, and he kind of gave me certain sources like Lopriano and a few other people who are quite prominent, like Parkinson, within the Kemet literature. Now, when I did the MA, my thesis was mind, body, and soul in Kemet, and I pretty much focused in on the Barker, Ib, and to a lesser extent the Ak, and there was some other influential works, and I more tried to focus on how Egyptologists and certain African-centered scholars of Benga, Karenga, Karabas to a certain extent, how they kind of defined and interpreted based on the literature and the text. Um, those what we normally say aspects of self or concepts of personhood, and within it, so I more explored their view and what the text saying. It was quite interesting on different levels. In the ideal light, if I had probably double the space, I would have liked to have then taken that material to specifically just focus on whether it's different regions of Africa or whether it had been a bit more zeroed in. Now, the PhD was within range once I was completing the thesis for the MA. And if honest with you, I wouldn't have um, really have thought at all about being a quote unquote doctor, doing a PhD and all that sort of stuff. And if I backtrack the story a little bit, I should mention that there was a junction where early in the path I kind of realized that I had like different areas in which to focus or could have focused and would have liked to focus. So having done many years where I've worked at one school, I've done the recruitment center thing. I also was at a college which is quite known in West London, having different aspects dealing with what you can certainly money wise, if you're organizing, certainly make decent payout of. I also had like deep interest in the music. I was quite a musical person, very creative. I'm not always yearning to jump on to be the head front of stage, so to speak, but always, got a lot of vibes. And I had actually developed what would be relatively a kind of unique vibe, unique sound, which I was quite confident could have pushed. And I also had a next sort of side thing where the fashion was opening up. However, when I got into the history and the culture, and there was this junction where I kind of knew where am I looking to focus my time, my energy. I kind of felt that there will always be a million and one people making music, the fashion. There'll always be many more people who take it a lot more serious about where does the hem go, or why did they put the zip that high, or these little things which I would not be able to deeply think about at all. And then, as I say, with the history and the culture side of it, I'm like from more northwest west borders, and most of the people of Caribbean African heritage. I grew up with very few people necessarily interested in the history on a deep light. Obviously, it's when the penny drops and you kind of like, oh, see, it's deep. A lot of people aren't really that interested to want to read much things, let alone read several books, let alone try and get qualified up. And I could see that it was one of these ones where if you keep having the same chefs giving you the same food, you're going to keep getting the same flavors. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and that's one of the things while jumping it back to the PhD in a second is that I think for myself, I kind of realized that that was a reality, and it's almost like for somebody to with the history and the culture, it's certainly from having just done the certificate, and because you think when you've read an article, you think you know everything about the subject, and you read a whole book and you realize, wow, there's so much more things, and then you look at the bibliography and you think, wow, there's so many people I'm even yet to read, and so you kind of get the depth of the situation. So going back to that junction, I kind of realized that I kind of really did take the misrepresentation of the history and the thing as a big disrespect, and was largely motivated, if honest, with a lot of the kind of ideas of what would be seeing the institutional racism and seeing it as trying to misrepresent it. Now, as I got a bit more into it, I kind of realized, if there's a person who's into orchestra music with several different instruments coming in and out, I'm aware that they might not be able to appreciate and articulate the vibe that some people might have when there's a djembe drum playing away in the background, you know? So
Yeah.
similarly, if someone sees Kate Moss as the epitome of beauty, someone who might be more voluptuous and, melanated might not then fit in that same criteria of beauty. And so logically, you need people who are into those drumming vibes, into those types of beauty who can then articulate what's really going on, But
Hmm.
so yeah, so that was it. So follow the path. And so the junction back to when I was doing the MA and the thesis, they've sent out the invite for applications to jump on the PhD. Now, if I'm honest with you, UCL is like a really well-known university, specifically the Institute of Archaeology. Admittedly, Cambridge has certain, I think, radiocarbon machinery which isn't present at the city. It's in central London, so it's not got a certain facilities like Cambridge for some of the chemistry side of things. However, it's really, really a big, important place. So I was kind of surprised that they sort of said, if you get a first, then you'll be able to get onto the actual PhD. Unfortunately, and I got to salute Stephen Quirk for being really helpful in various different junctions. And, I feel a bit bad, if honest with you, sometimes when I was doing the MA, because I was having to try and focus on learning a lot of these new other things I was doing as well. Because that's a point I should mention in passing, that I managed to do the issues in African archaeology under Kevin MacDonald, professor, and Andrew Reid. And so Kevin MacDonald's more specialized in Mali as well as West Africa more broadly. And Andrew Reid is more focused on what we call Bantu heartlands, East to South Africa. And he's a zoologist as well, so archaeology of and anatomies of.
Oh, looks like we lost him, and he'll be back. And hope you're still with us. He's given us an in-depth history of how he came into the study of Egyptology, and then when he returns, hopefully we'll get into how he got into the study of the Yoruba in relationship to the ancient Egyptians, and uh, that is something that this is kind of how we met, kind of cross studying some things, and hopefully, uh, if and when he returns, we will be able to explore that some more. And so, until he comes back, just want to share. I know we can't see a photo of him, but this is him in the center. Uh, and we'll get him to explain, hopefully, some of these images. And looks like he is back. So y'all get a good shot of my forehead.
Nice, nice. Looking good, looking good, looking nefa.
I'm sorry.
What was
uh,
the last thing you heard, please?
um, after you had talked about Stephen uh, Kurt, you mentioned, hold on, you mentioned two other individuals who helped you along, or some courses you were talking about. Uh, I don't know if you made a contribution to a work that they were doing, or you were taking a particular set of courses under these two individuals, and you kind of went out after that. Hold on, you muted. You got to unmute yourself.
I mentioned Andrew
Okay,
Reid. I mentioned
yeah.
Andrew Reid and Kevin MacDonald. And what I was saying is that Andrew Reid is the co-author of the book, which is called Ancient Egypt in Africa. And I believe you have the unpublished cover as one of your files to potentially show the audience while I'm talking. Now, what was so interesting is that that particular book contained lots of views from, namely people at the Institute of Archaeology, but several other authors, including Martin Bernal. and it really addressed from a variety of perspectives a lot of different issues regarding the idea of Egypt as African, or how to understand it in relation to wider Africa. And, you know, if honest, it would seem clearly there's some who would have the sub-Saharan model and North Africa, and you just kind of keep a sort of big block between them, and ideally there, Afro-Asia, like those lot of Niger, Congo, and you do your best. Well, seemingly do the best to construct a model which will enable you not to see the Nile as being of any relevance to the wider Africa. So when I was gonna jumped onto the MA originally, I was going to only do the Egyptian modules. There were several they did. One which would have been the main one was run by Stephen and Professor Tate, who again I should salute Professor Tate. He has always been very helpful and supportive, and he was actually the head of the Egyptian archaeology program at the time. I think why I managed to get on it quite well was because when we had our interview, I was very well abreast of Jan Assmann, who is quite an eminent Egyptologist, and so going back to the actual choosing the different modules was and the actual I was going to originally only do the Egyptology ones, however, such as landscape as well. But when I was on the first day where we'd have the sort of welcome to the university, I hope this is going to be a great occasion for you, which would have been in the auditorium. I was turned up and people were following different was to find out professors who would lead the groups over randomly as numbers swelled. One professor will lead a group over, and so I was about to join a particular group based on the getting directed to do so. However, it's Lisa Daniels, who's involved in organizing a lot of the run-ins at the institute. She actually was like, actually join that man over there. And when I went over to the man over there, he's standing on his own at the time. And obviously, when more people join him, you subsequently lead the group over. I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, this man looks really familiar. And he's quite a corpulent man, um, big beard, glasses, nice tweed jacket. And I'm looking at him thinking he looks familiar. Why does he look familiar? But then I sort of asked him, are you in? Because I've been watching loads of documentaries on Africa for the last whatever many years. Are you in any documentaries you Africa and that? And he said, yeah. Yeah, a few actually. And he's got American accent. And when I heard the American accent, it kind of clicked for me. I was like, were you in a documentary of Henry Louis Gates? And he was like, yeah, I was, because I remember him talking to Henry Louis Gates about a lot of the dates and understanding regarding ironworking
Mhm.
in its in complexity, and when it started getting put back a lot earlier, basically. So you're saying, yeah, nearly everywhere, at least 900 across Africa now. Originally, they were thinking there's many centuries in most places later or something, if I recollect the conversation. I mean, now they've got dates from many places very early, even earlier than that, of course. So
Mhm.
from then getting to talk to him, I sort of say to him that, I was thinking to do the issues in African archaeology because there was clearly a module in that. But I thought, I want to really just focus on this, all aspects of Kemet, in case, I turn up at some debate or turn up at whatever, and then that aspect's brought
Mhm.
up, and I just have to say, no comment, no comment, or it's not my area. Like, I prefer to. So I was thinking that was my original intention. But when he sort of was walking with me, having now in that short period the crowd is sort of swelled up a little bit and we're heading over to the auditorium, he must then suggest or say to me, really, I think trying to lure me in a bit, if us in hindsight, but he kind of said how, with Kerma, dating of Kerma, we're pretty much talking, let's say, approximately 2000 BC. He's like, right across, there's like so many sites of similar kind of dimension and scope, which aren't even covered. There's four people working in an area the size of France, like
Mhm.
competent, qualified people doing with the archaeology and stuff. And it was almost like a carrot or like, a fish going for the bait kind of thing. So I was like, you know what,
Yeah.
I definitely need to do the issues in African archaeology. So that encounter enabled me to get onto that program, which certainly coming from more an Afrocentric kind of paradigm, there's a certain abstraction because, you just see Africa as kind of like the big country, and
Mhm.
you're not necessarily so focused on, you're more on the highlights and the big and the grand and the most significant chapters at times, and not necessarily what would be the mundane. And yeah, so it was that was really important for me, sort of gaining a lot of sources of knowledge which subsequently contributed to the PhD. And I don't know if we should then move a bit deeper into the PhD, or there's any other questions you'd like to touch on before we move
No,
into
no,
it.
no. That was going to be the next question.
Great.
concerning the PhD itself. So you do your MA in research in ancient Kemet, then you meet this professor at a lecture, and he plants the seeds for archaeology. So how do you jump from archaeology to a relationship between the Yoruba and the ancient Egyptians, or the possible?
Okay. Well, two things I would say is that I was mentioning when I originally started the MA and I was choosing modules, I was yet to choose the modules. I had that encounter with the Africanist, and that enabled me to choose that as one of the additional modules, which subsequently gave me certain tools to add to the Afrocentric paradigms, as well as what would be the formal Egyptology as and that. So how it developed into the PhD, into focusing on the Yoruba, was that originally I was kind of more just trying to do continental approach, which in the mainstream, and I'd highlight the critical voices, what they'll term and how they would see some of the things, is if you kind of grab a couple things from lots of different parts, it's kind of seen as being the scattergun approach. So, you grabbing one thing from Central Africa, another thing from Ghana, and then the next thing from some part of the Sahara, whether it's a rock engraving, is that they're so far apart and almost so unrelated. It's very, try and argue it is a scattergun kind of approach. But I was largely trying to, in a very robust way, find these different parts to say, oh, that's similar, or this is, and hadn't yet confined the research more to the Yoruba. Now, if honest, two things unfolded. There was a point where, for the upgrade, Stephen Quirk recommended that there's a particular text which is sometimes known as Peret Hamaru 168, and is known as the Liturgy of Offerings to the Cavern dwellers in various texts such as Piankov. Now, that particular text mentions stools and a few other things, which, upon reading, are quite ethnographically relevant. And so there was a method that was devised, because at that time, there's been a few shifts and moves with supervisors based on areas of focus and what's their scope of expertise, so to speak. So MacDonald, Kevin, was very much emphasizing the need to do some ethnography, as in you can't do a comparison or aspects of comparison and not do ethnography, because I did already go through a lot of the different works by various scholars, and but however, it's another thing going and doing your own research. So originally I was thinking to go Ghana because I had already been there in 2007, so I caught the tail end of the 50th anniversary, and I had some good links. I happened to know the Adontahenia Techaman from that encounter, and he's always been really good source and contact for me. And if honest, I was planning to go there again. However, there's somebody a contact I made in London at some point, at a particular function, and we kept in contact once he had returned to Nigeria. And sort of miraculously, he said that his brother's going to be marrying the Onya of Ife's daughter. Now,
Mhm.
to understand it, there's a primordial source where the world and is seen as being its origin, as well as when we can talk about the first kingdom and it spread everywhere else, and that's seen as being Ile Ife from the cosmological perspective. And so the Oni of Ife presides as king over that particular kingdom, but also across the whole of Yorubaland is recognized as being the most ancient stool, and having a sacred character based on Ife having such a sacred nature and character, so it's this interchanging thing. So I'm really deep into the art. I've actually had several books I've been researching, so I'm very much aware of its historical prominence as well. So when he said that I could actually attend it, that was when I was like, wow, because I got people I know I grew up around the corner, don't even get invited for their wedding, and then I'm able to turn up to the Oni of Ife, the last born daughter getting married. What? They say God works. So so this is it. So once I actually went there, that led to the Yoruba paradigm just being subsequently being a hell of a lot of the focus. I did actually try in the thesis to look at Igbo to African Akan as a kind of cultural sphere, while acknowledging there's many different kingdoms and diversities of type of forms across that area. However, for it to be a PhD and seen as being really robust, and obviously the space and constraints, it was best just to focus on the Yoruba, and it led to also Ife and Oyo figuring really prominently because Shongo has a strong association with Oyo, which was a massive empire. Is typically seen as coming to fruition 16th, 17th century and then declining in the 18th. However, Shongo and a lot of like Trinidad, for which I'm a dual national, Trinidad and Tobago has a strong link with Shongo, as does certain parts of Cuba and Brazil. So those areas became the focus. But during the early parts of the PhD, I was really quite holistic. I was a bit all over the place. Fortunately, it allowed me to gain a lot of knowledge about different aspects by probing and trying to assess boundaries. As I mentioned, the Liturgy of Offerings to the Cavern Dwellers ended up becoming a focused text to do case study work, and then the ethnography, researching themes such as stooling, as I mentioned, as well as the significance of pots, because pots in the ethnography become very significant for shrines and different aspects of the customs. So that was how it sort of developed into it, and subsequently ended up going to Nigeria, Yoruba land 3 times, and while I've been confined to the southwest, lucky enough to have met many of the different kings and different kingdoms, such as Owo. I got to visit, as well as the Owo of Adonre. I got to meet personally on 2 occasions, and that's somebody who I think, for what you're interested in, has a very interesting account. I don't know if you'd like me to continue. Why?
No,
No,
you continue. I was just
continue. I was just All right. So if you can
showing a
imagine,
few.
showing a few. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So from
Oh,
previously, I'm aware that you're very interested in the different oral accounts. Now, what's so interesting with the literature and then when you do ethnography is that sometimes you can read something in the literature and take it as if it's so gospel, and then you'll go on the ground and you'll sometimes find uh, a kind of an array of different interpretations, and it's hard to sort of remedy those. And this is why, for myself, I kind of highlight these different paradigms which you almost have to transcend to almost be able to get with the actual what's going on with it. So I said to you already, there's an indigenous autochthonous idea of the world beginning in Ile Ife, and they expand into the different regions and parts that we know as the world today, and that human beings, both black and white, originated there and spread to their different quadrants. However, there's another account, which is the idea of there being an east influence from the east. And within this, it's not uncommon to hear Odadua as coming from the east in some accounts. It must be emphasized that from an Ife perspective, it's very much nonsensical, as Odadua is seen as being creator of the world and the soil of Ile Ife being sacred to him. Now, you can also, however, as I mentioned, you'll see in certain texts ideas of links to the East. And in my ethnography, the first Oba that I actually met was the Owa of Adonre, and he actually said is that Odadua comes from Upper Egypt. I left there a bit confused, thinking, does he know that I was researching such things or interested in such things? Is that what he logically thought? Well, Egypt's seen as being really ancient. It probably originated there. Or was it actually an ancestral tradition that's passed down that understands that? So this is it. So, but it's important to understand there's a kind of there's what would be a native autochthonous version, and then there's the idea of a movement for the East. But I know the Alafin, who's the Alafin of Oyo, the title of the Emperor of Oyo and Yoruba land, formerly was the note, had a note where he mentioned there's various different accounts about there being links with the East, whether from Mecca or from Egypt. However, what's more needed is a serious anthropological study looking at the culture to identify what could be these similarities or actual connections, which hitherto remain largely unknown.
hold on one second. Um, what?
What?
Hold on. What? research, I'm pretty sure that there is not that much, and I just know this from personal experience, but I imagine, for you doing this type of work, that there's not that much literature that seriously attempts to connect, Egypt and the Yoruba people outside of these little snippets here and there, concerning possible migrations either from Mecca or the Nile Valley. And so, what was it like navigating in trying to find information, and for if there was a lack of information, how did you circumnavigate that and find what you were looking for?
Okay, well, what it was with myself, I was there trying to look at how living traditions and practices can give us new understandings or deeper understandings of the ancient materials. So within that, this caused me to focus on more trying to find affinities, which on one level you can say, oh, that's a bit like a snap when you can see an image that might be similar. However, by looking at the actual practices and what they do with it, how does that inform or give understanding? Because as I mentioned, what the Alafin kind of asked was actually for more of a comparative studies to sort of disclose what would be similar or not similar, because it seems that there are various different accounts of some kingdoms or peoples having the links to the east. I mean, it's interesting with the paradigms, I should say, that some people interpret as if there's an earlier movement from the Nile, whether that's Upper Egypt or Merowe direction, and that there's a subsequent movement from Mecca, which would perhaps account for certain aspects what are affiliated or synonymous with quote unquote Arabic culture kind of thing. Now, in the mainstream literature, there's two kind of terms that come about which are encountered to try and look at these links. As you mentioned, there's not too many people have discussed it. One person who has is Lawal, I believe it's 1970 or 1971. It was actually published, his thesis submitted, and he pretty much focuses on looking at the sort of substratum approach. If you're not familiar with the substratum approach, it's the idea is though the affinities or similarities between, let's say, certain African groups such as the Yoruba and ancient Egypt in this case, it would be accounted for by what would be the Neolithic substratum. You can get different dates, but let's say 5,000 to 3,000 approximately, although some might argue quite a lot earlier, depending on how you monitor it in some cases. Nonetheless, that is a substratum which would almost argue that they have like common ancestors there, and then people went their different directions. Theoretically, the Yoruba went south or southwest, and then the people of Kemet went um, east and northeast. And then there's a other argument, which is the diffusion. Now, diffusion can be tied up in migration, but it's largely seen, although in recent times, I think there's a bit of a change of tide, but it's largely a really taboo word, a taboo term. And even for a lot of people, from an African centered perspective, you're like perhaps yearning to see affinities, connections, because you see those as icons of African culture unity, togetherness, Ubuntu kind of thing. But for people on the ground, it can be interpreted as though you're almost saying that we couldn't come up with our own thing, or you're trying to imply that it was upon these non-natives coming and bringing something that we were then able to. So, some people will be passionately really against it and stuff. And so, one person who is Dr. Jala, he sort of said, even if there are links and there are things, what percentage of the culture would, it amount to, so to speak, because, a culture can have thousands of different components. But in regards to the ancient Egypt, it's interesting where I was more from my research trying to find affinities and trying to find the ways in which those can then enlighten and empower, and sort of getting that there's going to be every, you can argue every culture in Africa has its unique kind of style and way of doing things at the same time. So that's what I try to focus on.
All right, all right. Um, so hold on one second. Get this echo out. So, what sorts of things did you discover in that process that made you say there was some strong affinities? And if there were strong affinities between the Nile River civilization and the Niger civilization of the Yoruba people, what could you say, if there is strong affinities between the two, that was something that was shared inheritance or something that was diffused? And how could you tell, between the two?
All right, well, let's take question by question. The first one you want me to answer is,
Oh, okay. The Did you find affinities between the Nile River culture of ancient Kemet and the Yoruba people? And then the second question is, if you did, was it the result of diffusion or coincidence or uh, inheritance from a common ancestor?
okay, yeah, so in regards to affinities, I mentioned early into the PhD, although I wasn't confined solely to the Yoruba, I was pretty much looking at various different aspects. So there's a person by the name of Hassan El Shami who looks at the folk tales, and I was really interested in looking the literature I mentioned since I was doing the diploma. And then I was also very focused on different aspects of arts and trying to look for motifs. And so when I got into the Yoruba, and there was quite a few lines that opened up. So various different aspects when I would try and rebuttal what would be the argument. So, for example, someone will say, okay, there's a few similarities, but the cosmologies are really different. So that would then lead me to try and investigate all the different ones. And, I've got many years of study in ancient Kemet materials. I'm going to obviously be able to notice ones which overlap or seem quite similar, whether it's some dualistic element or whatnot. So I'd end up I'm finding affinities by typically proving wrong some of the arguments which people would forward to say, oh, they're so different because of, and then I would sort of show different things that would highlight that there's actually similarities. So even in regards to the literature, if I'm not sure how familiar you are with different genres, but they include one of them which would be called the harpist song. Harpist songs are sometimes quoted as being, and they're normally for Egyptologists a bit confusing because they're in the tomb where the figuratively the tomb is meant to facilitate the resurrection or the eternal life, and then you'll have the harpist songs which pretty much describe the idea of you know lamenting about life going and no one knows tomorrow, so there's drink and enjoy, and sort of what would be seen as a hedonistic vision. And so I originally didn't think, I was like, are they translating this correctly? Because some of the things you could easily, by translating different parts slightly differently, have very different readings. So that was what I actually first thought when, because I was thinking that shouldn't be in the tomb, that sort of thing, because it seems pessimistic and seems almost the opposite of what you'd imagine. However, I ended up coming across similar types of genre, specifically from Dahomey to Yoruba. And again, from the literature, I also, for the thesis, looked heavily at Shongo. So I should really highlight that Shongo and the devotion associated was what took up largely chapter 5 and chapter 4. I looked largely at the text in comparison I mentioned earlier, and that pretty much unearthed, that's the liturgy of offerings to the Cavern dwellers, and that pretty much unearthed a lot of different affinities, which chapter 5 subsequently explored a lot further. So the point is, yeah, there's a lot of affinities I encountered, which I think it's not hard, certainly for, I told you that of the arguments which are there, there's the idea of substratum, where things probably originated long, long time ago, then they went their own way, or they have the building blocks of similar outlook from long time ago. So when they're manifesting later on in different places, there might be echoes of similarities, and so to speak. There's an idea which I didn't mention of Sutton as well, which is the idea of going like trade routes, as if for many centuries, if not millenniums, that there's sort of cross continental trade routes basically, and various groups perhaps from the west have access to in surplus to tin, and then in the east you would have various different ores such as copper, and so those two are essential for the casting process and stuff like that. So there's obviously the argument of diffusion from the Kemet, but there's also strong arguments that people put forward from the west to the east. So for myself, if you look at the dates, you would think, okay, well, we can actually date most of the stuff. If they're historically connected, we can date quite easily a lot of the stuff from the ancient Nile to the BC, or deep time into BC, 2,000, 3,000 years at time. Um, However, I think there's a lot of archaeology that's really yet to be done. I mentioned earlier, all those years ago, when I was told there's only like 4 people doing serious archaeology in this in an area the size of France. And if you were to think about it, it's like so many areas and parts of Sudan are yet to be done. And perhaps what's maybe an elephant in the room for people that do believe or do accept there's movements or connections from the east and the west, whether from the Nile to Niger. Chad would then have to figure in quite heavily into further research to illuminate deep things. But I think for the hardcore critics, which, some of them are valid points and lines of rationale, they'll kind of argue that until you see, intricate built pyramids and abundance of mummies and hieroglyphs, then they're very different cultures. And that's sadly a paradigm which I think for mainstream, for many of people, those are their 3 main tropes of interest. They wouldn't maybe easily be able to like merge it into its African setting and environment based on those issues. Are you still with me?
Sorry, it was on mute.
No problem.
So hold on one sec. Hold on one sec. There we go. So with that being said, what how did you get around the material culture? Now, like for me, I like to deal with language. And so for me, the connections, there's some archaeological connections that could be made, but when in terms of affinities, the first place that I go to is the language, because the language is going to explain basically the psychology of the people. And if you find the same terms for the same phenomena in 2 different cultures, and they are not the result of chance or diffusion, in linguistics we call it borrowing, you have a stronger ground to argue that we can probably utilize this culture here to produce a model for understanding obscure aspects of the ancient Egyptian, because we no longer have a living tradition. And that's what I've been able to do with like Bantu, especially Congo and South African cultures. And from there, because you won't be able to get away from the language piece. So the question now being, well, what tools of analysis did you have to utilize to make the kinds of arguments that you made in your dissertation?
Okay. So I mentioned there's two major comparative chapters which utilize quite different methods. The first comparative chapter, which I identified as the Liturgy of Offerings to the Cavern Dwellers, which is an ancient text also known as Peret Emaru 168, that involved more mainstream formal approaches and then subsequently identifying a couple key themes, which include the notions of stools, pots, shrines, and concepts of self, because in that same text, I was also looking at the ideas of how the bar and the car are orientated, and subsequently doing the ethnography and trying to utilize the different aspects to gain more of a paradigm of their actual processes. However, during that time and in that phase, there was an accumulation of different themes and icons. And so the ones that related largely to Osiris or Asar, I ended up including inside that chapter. But for the other chapter I mentioned to you, which is about Shongo compared with our moon, there's a series of different studies that take place, and I try to propose a method where first I give an introduction to the name and identity, and some of the historical background to the deity. I then subsequently focus on one image or the image and representation of the deity, and in this case it was Shongo and the moon. And then I then focus on one particular icon, and for Shongo it was the Oshe, and for our moon, it was the Ramajis, but also a moon ram more broadly was touched upon. So if you can imagine, there was different sections which in turn would look at Shongo in relation to the material culture of Kemet, and to illuminate various aspects of the point, with ideally, if there's if there's an aspect that overlaps with a moon, that would then take precedence in terms of how I would break it down. And subsequently, having done that, I ended up also doing a comparison of the literature, namely looking at the what we call the New Kingdom or the New Empire texts of Amun Ra in relation to Shongo devotion, or Shungo Ariki, which is known as Shongo Pipe. So, and interestingly, I was actually going to have a supplement of the language, which wasn't included. I actually done some comparison stuff myself. Interestingly, I saw in your recent work a couple of them in there. There's a few different interpretations we have on a few bits and bobs of, I think, with the dotted H. But we'll talk about that another time and stuff. But yeah, it's interesting where I noticed with the WD and the WD/J, how there were certain overlaps over there. I was another time, if we have a chance, we'll go over the linguistic elements. However, yeah, I do think there's a lot to be done, and fortunately, it's heading in the right direction. I think a lot of things which would have seemed so far fetched, or based on the time and issues in the background, wouldn't really be possible. I think now there's a much bigger reception for these things. So yeah, there's a void that's needing to be filled, and as you say, language plays an important part. And I was going to actually mention when you were talking that, and is that the Indo-European is that, if you were to imagine, it was built largely on the language, but they weren't needing to show here's the arts are the same or here's this. I'm not saying there's not studies on folklore or other things trying to show other aspects of unity, but the language obviously was the bedrock of that. And I think there's many African-centered approaches which haven't been digested. The only issue I'd say from my encounter is that with the more mainstream critical paradigms is that they're very orientated on the morphology, and so I think that's the battle to try and take as well, to really try and shake it, because unfortunately, from African center paradigm, it's quite clear. It's like the goalposts are moved, the goalposts are moved, like so but yeah, this is the battle we find ourselves. And I think sometimes, interestingly, certainly for my thesis I mentioned earlier, when one scholar says, oh, there's even if there was connections, very unlikely we'd see anything similar in the arts. That's exactly what I'll try and find to show similarities in certain aspects of the arts. One will say, oh, they've got kind of vague similarities, but very different in terms of cosmology. I'll then show various different aspects of cosmology that overlap. One scholar will say, oh, there's no trace of sun worship in the Yoruba, and then I'll show loads of tropes of what's known as solar devotion. So sometimes what seems yeah, it really like ends up broadening horizon, because this is what I was going to say as well, is that certainly from African centered paradigm, the ancient now, if they're as brown as Bob Marley or Barack Obama, then they're black, and if they're in the ancient now, then they're African. So there's, but from the critical mind, even if the, the critics, they'll be like, even if they are black, ethnically, like, or in melanin, like culturally, what they believe, what they do, is they're trying to fill that void of the overlaps of the wider African culture. And that's what I tried to fill in with, namely those case studies I just introduced to you.
Yeah, morphology is, from a linguistic point of view, is very important, but so is semantics. And that's something that, not too many folks deal with. Like, I'm currently working on a journal article, or an article to be submitted to a journal, a linguistic journal, on the etymology of the Yoruba word orisha, and how it can be found in the ancient Egyptian language under different variations. One including the so-called ak, which is really rak, because the vulture glyph is a nasalized volar trill. It's a type of R sound, and there's different ways that we can demonstrate that. And so you can call them literally, an orisha. Um, and and I'm just wrapping up a second segment of the same paper that demonstrates that even the word Ra is cognate with the word Orisha, because it's really not Ra. The lowercase a is a consonant, and you'll see different variations in terms of, or I should say, different interpretations of that arm glyph, uh, which we transliterate as lowercase a for those who are into the Meta Nature studies. And that, it goes to show like the deep aspects, because a lot of a lot of researchers don't know about paronymy, and like just the deep aspects of African culture, and how they will make up whole myths based on folk etymology of words and make associations. And so they're like, there's a whole paradigm of things that people have to understand before even engaging on the linguistic work and things. And I know that, uh, this is going to be stuff that is raised and brought out in the near future. I'm trying to pull up. I want to share my screen uh, real quick, and I want to get your opinion on these different aspects. I did a presentation some time ago dealing with, possible affinities. And I want you to tell me if you believe this is inheritance, or uh, diffusion, or chance. And so give me a second here to share the screen. And hopefully you can see it. When you do, unmuting your mic. So let me, I'm gonna skip a lot of stuff and just highlighting some African scholars people may not be familiar with. Of course, Dr. Sheikh Diop. You mentioned Dr. Jacob Carruthers as one of your source material. Dr. Raketi Amin. In the French-speaking world, Abu Bakr Musalam. Uh, this is Dr. Baba Call Saul, one of my mentors here, Dr. Muba Bingay Balolo, and the late Unc Ra, another linguist, mentor to me here, Jean Claude Mboli. Of course, that's me. Um, but let me uh, try to find.
You know, it's kind of late over here. It's coming up to 10, 11:30. You know that, yeah?
uh, I'll be quick. I'll be quick. I know it's towards the end. Why is it showing up? Okay, here we go. That these are more East African folks. It's more Congo affiliation.
I should highlight again with the thesis, I wasn't the when I'm looking at the affinities, it was much more trying to illuminate what we can learn from the living tradition. So, for example, if there was like a sword or something like that, it would be obviously the form is kind of clear that there's a similarity, but more by looking at the context that the sword of office was used in, the times in which they would use these ceremonies and its symbolism, and then casting that sort of vein. So, for instance, in the Yoruba context in Lile Ife, there's a custodian called Owa Eredume, who's based at the shrine of Oromio, where you find Opa Oroyo, the Oromiyo staff. And so when he confers that sword, it then gives the king, figuratively or literally, you would say in ancient times, the right over life and death. And so that's the sort of the objective and the orientation. So as I say to you, there's various things for me which when you're showing the East African ones, I'll just commentate while you're finding images you want to show. Is
I think it's
but
good because I did two presentations.
yeah, but I'm
So
thinking
this
if we
one I
can
think
with
is
presentation, if we can with presentation thing, I reckon it'll be. Let's link up another time. We can do a bit more of the linguistics and stuff. But I'll just because I'm thinking if it's like I chase it down. But I'll just say in regards to what I didn't emphasize is that a lot of people see there being a Nilotic substratum. So in that view, there's somebody I didn't mention called Frankfurt, and he was kind of a bit of a champion of the the substrata model, and he would argue that there's a sort of Neolithic heartland in which Kemet sort of evolved out of, and that's why I think he would see various different Nilotic groups, whether from Shilluk Nuer down to Uganda, Kenya kind of sides, as being what would be the most similar, and where he would confine his approach.
I see, I see. Yeah, it was more so not dealing with language here today, but like representations that you see. For example, this particular relief on the right hand side, where you see this unique hairstyles and the scarification on the forehead and the cheeks. And you see these, like this bronze head of Noba King from Edo with the same type of hairstyle and scarification on, between the two cultures. And so the work is asking, were you doing that kind of analysis, or it was just mainly like, like a funerary comparisons, or like kingship and kinship and the like. How important was the art in terms of the comparison?
Okay, well, in regards to the latter point, the art was very important in the comparison. I looked at a lot of the material culture ranging from Ile Ife, looking at a lot of the Edo Benin, who Oromio is a founder of, as well as Oyo and Owo. Owo is not as well known, but they're a really important site who appear to have styles characteristic both of the naturalism and the striations of Ile Ife as well as Benin Edo. So in regards to the scarifications, yeah, there's really interesting aspects of scarifications, as sometimes they call it facial striations. Susan Blier, she actually in her book looking at Ile Ife, I think it's 2015, she had a section where she really looks quite deep into the ancient representations of the scarifications as well as their distribution into contemporary areas. In my own research, I happened to find that there's a particular type of scarification which is called the Pele mark, which is three marks down the cheek vertically on either side, and you find that still adorning faces in Sudan, and you find it on some of the Merowe, for example, in the Khartoum Museum. There's a coffin which is anthropomorphic with a face that actually has those three lines on the cheek, and you find that as one of the common markers in Yoruba land as a generic facial marker and stuff. There's a few people who have looked further and deeper into the historical ramifications of it, um, but I would argue that critically there's certain facial marks which can actually seemingly be the same type of facial mark. So one being on the forehead for the critics would be like, yeah, like the Africans with a similar hairstyle, but one being on the forehead and then one being a very different style of facial mark, because the facial marks are meant to be often generic of that ethnic group, you know. So, but we do find a lot of the some people. I went to a Nubia conference in Austria, I believe, and there was a lady actually who focused upon looking at the ancient scarification and the contemporary tribes that have the same ones, and I believe that a lot of them are in Sudan to Ethiopia with the versions that you see. Although there's a couple I do see as reminiscent of the West African styles as well.
Indeed. And you sent me two other photos, and I wanted to, before you go, um, you to speak on the photos that you sent me. So we seen the book cover, and you went into detail of the relationship between that and the research that you were doing. Right now, I'm posting up the photo of, it looks like an African woman alongside kind of a split screen, with a motif from ancient Egypt. Can you explain this?
Okay, well, what ideally, if that came a bit earlier, I could have, I should have mentioned it, because in my research at the beginning, one of
Uh-huh.
the elements I was trying to do was help and focus on reconceptualizing the ancient Nile in this African context. One way in which I found quite useful was doing a lot of the motif, um, jewel type pictures so that you could see a closer connection, because I believe that people, even now in the studies, they sort of have a view that the Egyptians, quote unquote, are one race, the Nubians, quote unquote, another race. And then they'll look at what will be sometimes stereotypical or almost caricature images of representations at times to dramatize at times the difference, during sometimes there's political issues and things in the background, and see those as real black people, and black people, you can relate to those guys, whereas the Egyptians or people of Kemet, they're not black and know nothing to do with them, kind of thing. So one thing what I found was a good remedy was I had like a massive collage. When I say massive, it was approximately 20, 30 pictures
Mhm.
of different people from Central Africa, Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, but people you would think of and recognize as being quote unquote sub-Saharan stereotypically, because this lady, she's Barbara Naja from Ghana, and again, it was quite. I know her many years, and she, interestingly, I always thought she looked kind of Egyptian, and I put her next to the the
Mhm.
sculpture. It was quite surreal and stuff, and she looks a bit like a fertility doll as well. So interestingly, the Gars, going back to one of your points, has a migration account from some times from Egypt. If you look, you'll find. But going back to this, there was a series of collages to really try and reconceptualize the ancient Nile and its material culture as African. And I think often when people are looking at the materials, sometimes it's with the weird shadows and there's the strange and the bizarre sometimes is what you're getting a lot of the books. You're not really always seeing lines of affinity that are present and apparent.
Mhm. Indeed. And Lastly, this photo.
Yeah, so this photo is an example of what I tried to focus on, which was looking at a lot of the time Pacific motifs and then trying to recast them and understand them in relation to the ethnography, the living traditions. So on the left-hand side, you have what's normally often called the hunter's palette, and it has a series of different scenes and seen as being early dynastic historical framing for the ancient Kemet. Now, if you look at the what would be the figure on the image on the left, the hand holding what is an axe, you would see that the form of the axe is a bit similar to what's then on a Shongo pot. One of the motifs is commonly, or one of the most common icons for Shongo is the O'Shea. Now, interestingly, you find a great variety in which they can occur in. However, one of the major case studies I mentioned, I looked at the gods Amun and Shongo and individually identified the icon for serious case study. And for Shongo, it was the O'Shea. So I explored many of the different forms that you find O'Shea appearing and then showed analogies with many of the different similar motifs from the Nile. And so this is basically an example of that.
Appreciate it. Appreciate it. So, just one more picture, if you don't mind. So, you know, you are in embroiled into, the Yoruba culture and study, and it's not just an academic thing. Um, can you, explain like the uh, your lack of a better term, installment and your Yoruba name?
Okay, great. Just to introduce myself in Yoruba, it'd be Oruku Mini Oloye Babasha or Mio Ile Ife. And again, if the academic and the cultural or spiritual can be quite different paths, but for myself, there's been many blessings and different junctions that have led along this path. And very interestingly, I remember when I submitted the thesis originally in 2018, and I almost kind of felt like a lot of the people I thought would be most interested or most supportive at times, I think it was almost like a lot of them obviously weren't so deep into it, or some of them, I think maybe they would have, someone will say, oh, Akhenaten's just so anti-African, and then you'll show a similarity with, certain Gar prayers. And so they, so they would maybe not be as receptive as I thought some of the people who were most interested. So when I was heading out to Nigeria the last time, it was I was basically invited out there, got a call from the Oyo Palace, and I also coincided with there being the Oyo Palace for Alaafen's 80th birthday. And interestingly, there was also going to be the Olojo Festival. So those two things got me out there. And then when I happened to be out there, I had a copy of the thesis that I just submitted, which I was planning to give at the birthday, and I got to show it to some of the custodians who were in the book. So I mentioned to you that in Ile Ife, for example, they have a grade of custodians called Oba Isaro, and they are basically like chief priests, but in a spiritual light, there's an essence of incarnation of the deity that they serve, as if the deity resides within them. So the picture you can see before you is the image including Owa Eridume, who's the more melanated gentleman, and then you have Obalara, who is of Obatala. So that's in front of Opa Oromio. Now, what ended up happening, as I said, I showed it to various different custodians just for them to see themselves. Some of them were more just keen to see themselves and such, and then others were much more interested in the overall research, seeing a lot of these images and affinities and stuff across Yoruba land. And then interestingly, I should mention that Obalara, who's on in the picture, is to the left. He is the custodian of Oberlufon, and Oberlufon is seen as presiding over the fine arts and regalia. And one of the most important masks of Copperworks is is called the Oberlufon mask, and it's seen as though the guild of artists were from his lineage. And with Owa Eridume, he's seen as being a bit more, or Emil is seen as being kind of warlike a bit and expanding the empire and being like a savior kind of character. There was a bit of a conflict between Obalufon and Oromio in the history and the culture of it. But what's quite ironic about it is that both of those two guys, gentlemen that you see before you, they are both really deep into the culture. And when I showed Owa Eridume the thesis, he was just blown away about the different places I had been and was just like, when he's seeing all the affinities, because if you can imagine, there was a lot of images that relate to Edo Benin in there. You showed a mask from Edo Benin a little bit earlier. And then there was a lot of it relating to Shongo, which is Oyo. And Oromio is seen as having a child in Edo Benin and having a child in the area of Oyo. So when I showed it to him and he was so amazed, he said, wow, like, he's like, deep, like kind of, those sort of expressions. And I jokingly said to him, my operators the Jagun la Ashrag Baye. And then he is like, but that title doesn't exist. But I can give you Babasha. You want Babasha? And destiny, it felt like blessed and it felt right. And as I say to you, the tallest monolith outside of Northeast Africa is the Opo Oroyo or Oromio staff, which is approximately 8 foot, 18-foot tall granite staff. And they say in the background. So yeah, it worked out really well. They say Ishe Olua, God works, the workings of God.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I appreciate you sharing your time with us, and not only your time, but your knowledge and your experience and insights to African culture and just your path. And hopefully in the future we can get you on and we can talk about more narrow and specific and deeper things. Um, but this would be my last question to you, and that is, of course, do you plan on publishing your thesis in book form? And if so, when do you when do you see that happening in the future?
Okay, well, thank you for your kind words. I would like to reciprocate them back at yourself. I'll be honest with you, I wasn't feeling 100% today, but I kind of didn't want to let you down because I know for a while you were wanting me to do this, and I did give my word. So I thought, so hopefully next time we speak, it'll be a bit earlier as well. So there'll be a bit more energy
Yeah.
and vibes up in the building. But anyway, in regards to the publishing, the ideal scenario is that the thesis kind of gets divided into three areas. The first area is pretty much looking at the philosophy of understanding the ancient Nile and its relevance to notions of Pan Africanism or African unity and how it can be used as a tool in some regards.
Hmm.
And this will also lay out the arguments from the African centered schools of how we should understanding Africa, how it is clearly African, and from that sort of stance. I didn't mention other things with like new discoveries from archaeology. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Yellow Nile.
The yellow now?
Yeah.
No.
All right, we'll talk about that another time. But that sort of is seen as now being a wadi, but would head west and stuff. But anyway, there's um there's a lot of issues which would be raised in those first issues, which would first chapters, which would largely summarize and kind of give a rebuttals for many of the people who try to or who don't want to really conceptualize it as African and show lines of how it is African and the sort of wide body of scholars which have done good works. Then the other chapter would largely focus on just what's been comparison and try and bring together a lot of different people's scholars and of bygone years who've done these comparisons. Because what's so interesting is that I'm not sure, I'm not, um, my work isn't based on many of these things, but there's a part of my chapter where I summarize a lot of the historical European schools who would highlight a lot of these links between the Nile and the ancient Egypt. So you had like Albert Church Ward, and you had obviously Baja mentioned. There was, in fact, a really early book which looks at, I believe it's late 1700s, which looks at the idea of ancient Egypt and Nigritia, the way it's spelled. It's
Mhm.
a French title. So there's a that's a whole side of historicism, and then you have the more modern school, there's like, for example, quite unknown. It would be great if it was translated into English. Was Autori, who looked at the civilization of ancient Egypt and Africa, and
You
you
talking
know
about
these like
Joseph Altuve?
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. So, so there's like many people and then of course there's, you know, the great body, a lot of them you'll find on Ankh Journal online and stuff, of pushing for the African centered scene. If honest, the Franco African is doing a lot of work in those different sides, not least the languages we mentioned as well. But that would be really just trying to sort of concisely summarize where things are at, what's gone on, and methodology. A lot of just focus on methodology and pathways moving forward. And then again, the third part would likely be the case studies, which I go really deep and stuff like that, looking at Shongo and our moon, and that, if honest, could stand alone because I had to cut out a lot of material, and you know, there's a lot of, because this is what I say, if you do the ethnography, there's so many different interpretations and ways that things come to life in a certain way, you know. So so yeah, so this is it. But touch wood, there should be a lot of forthcoming publications. I look forward to sending you some of my comparative materials with the Yoruba as well. I did some a few different methods I think you'll find interesting in that. So hopefully you give me negative or bad good feedback. It would be nice to hear you hear either way. And again, you know, thank you for your time. Hope all the listeners found something that was of interest, and wishing everybody peace, blessings, and a good night.
Indeed, indeed. And with that said, I am going to share the contact information. So again, if y'all need to contact the channel for any reason, you can hit up these social media platforms. Uh, so Twitter, Instagram, of course, Facebook, and YouTube. And of course, you can support the channel either by joining the Patreon page at patreon.com/asarimhotep, or you can send a gift via the Cash App. And so I'd like to thank a million times again our guest for bearing through late night sleepiness all the way from the UK to have a conversation with your brother. And hopefully this will not be the only time. And again, you know, we'll have him back and highlight the progress of his research. And so I appreciate the work he's doing. I appreciate him, and I appreciate all of you for listening and sharing and liking this video and all videos, you know, on the channel. So with that, y'all have a blessed holiday, and I will see you next time.